Welcome to Living Word Ministries with our director and Bible teacher, Debbie Blank. Debbie's passion is for you to understand and apply God's truths to your life. Now let's listen and enjoy teaching from the Word of God with Debbie Blank.
The difference between Hamas and Hezbollah. The West Bank is the backwards B territory right in the middle of Israel that is controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Their military arm is called Fatah. They're a little bit more moderate, if you can use that term with them, and I don't know that you can, but they're a little bit more moderate than Hamas. Hamas is the military arm for the people in the Gaza Strip. Now, the Gaza Strip is also Palestinian Authority, but they're two factions, Hamas and Fatah, that do not get along, because Hamas is controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood, which is highly radical and is terrorist, and the Fatah in the West Bank is controlled by the Palestinian that isn't quite as bad as Hamas. Not quite as bad, but it depends on how you interpret it. That's the difference in the two. Hamas is the military arm of the Gaza Strip, and Fatah is the military arm of the West Bank. These are threats that have just come up in the last few months. I mean, yeah, Iran's been a threat for years, but the real threat's just coming up. ISIS, the terrorist activities in Hamas, all these things are coming up, and they're not accidents. It's not an accident that Iran was on the border in the Golan Heights. They weren't just there to help out the rebels in Syria. They were there to start planning strategic attacks against Israel. Now, those of you who are going to Israel with me in 3 weeks, don't be afraid of all this, because quite frankly, the nice thing is it's still winter in Israel. And just as the weather can get real rainy and real crummy at any time, the terrorists don't want to fight in that kind of weather. So they usually back off this time of year for their fighting and wait until the nicer months. So what I think start happening in Israel, may not start happening until after we're gone. But wait and see. We've got to see some of these other things. And I'll tell you why. Because, see, all of these phenomenons that we're going to start seeing all start after we leave. I just have been praising the Lord that our trip was originally scheduled for April. And we moved it back because it was going to cost $500 more for the airplane trip. I mean, who wants to pay $500 for nothing except a different time? And now I'm going, oh, thank you, God, that we're going to be out of there by March 11th. Because a lot's going on. One of the things that you're all familiar with are the blood moons. The Bible talks in several places. One is in Acts chapter 2, which is quoting the book of Joel, when Peter says that in these last days we will see blood moons. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord, is what it says. Also in Revelation 6, verse 12, I believe it is, it says that after the tribulation starts, we're going to see what's called blood moons. Well, timing-wise, we don't fit into the Revelation 6 portion. We're not there. It doesn't work out in these blood moons. What does work out is what is prophesied, that we are going to see the sun turn to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord. We also know from Genesis 1:14 that when God made the lights in the expanse of the heavens, he separated day and night. He separated them for day and night, and he also said, let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. So God uses the sun and the moon and the stars for signs. And boy, if you've ever seen a sign, these blood moons are it. Now, I don't know exactly what the sign is, but it is so rare. Now, let me tell you what a blood moon is. Well, let me ask you, what is a blood moon? For those of you who know. First of all, what is a blood moon? What does that phrase actually mean? The moon is red. And when does the moon turn red? A total lunar eclipse. So a blood moon is not unusual. Whenever there's a total lunar eclipse, it happens. So what makes these blood moons unusual? Okay, they fall on the feast days. What else makes them unusual? There are 4 in a row that fall on Jewish feast days. Now you have the dates up here. The 2 have already passed. Passover last year, April 15th. Sukkot last year, October 8th. What's Passover? In regards to the feast, where does that fall? It's the first feast of the 7 feasts in Leviticus 23 that I showed you earlier on a PowerPoint. Where does, I shouldn't say Sukkot there, what it should say is Feast of Tabernacles, because that's a biblical term. Where does that fall in the listing of the 7 feasts? The last feast. This is the last feast here. So we had a blood moon, a lunar eclipse on the first Jewish feast of last year and the last Jewish feast of last year. And according to this scientific phenomenon, we will have another blood moon on Passover this year, which is April 4th. And we will have another blood moon on the Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, on September 28th of this year. The first and the last feast days of the year for the Jews. Now that's rare. These are called tetrads because you have 4 total lunar eclipses in a row. Blood moon, lunar eclipses. Supermoon, that's right. The last one that's coming is not only a supermoon, as Jan says, but it's the only one of the 4 that will be seen from Israel. None of the rest of them will be seen from Israel. This is so unique. 4 blood moons in a row happening on Jewish feasts. Not to mention the first and the last and the first and the last. But 4 in a row. This is so unique, it's only happened, will have happened, 3 times in the 1,000-year period from 1500, technically 1493, to 2500 AD. In that whole 1,000-year period, it will have only happened 3 times. This is one. The first one was in 1949, 1950. What significant happened in 1949 and 50 relating to Israel? It became a state in 48, but it was 1949 that the War of Independence was over and they were secure in their land that they had become a state in. Because if you know the history, the day after they declared statehood, 5 surrounding nations came up to battle against Israel, and they never should have won. They should have been wiped out, and they weren't, miraculously. But that war lasted 15 months. By the time they'd had the first blood moon, it was after that that the war ended. And Israel was secure as they can be, secure in their land. That was a specific, important date. The next set of blood moons happened in 1967. What's so significant about 1967? Okay, on June 7th of 1967, Israel gained control of Jerusalem for the first time in 2,500 years. Because when they became a state, they did not conquer East Jerusalem. That remained in the hand of the Arabs. So it was in 1967 that Israel gained control of Jerusalem during the Six-Day War. And that was right after a blood moon started in this 4 tetrads. Now just think about this. You have 3 tetrads. 1949, Israel becomes a nation and is secure. 1967, they get control of Jerusalem. And now 2014, 2015. We're looking at a 70-year period here, folks. Little less than 70 years. Big number we'll talk about in a little bit. 70-year period, we have 3 tetrads. There's no tetrads before that until you go back to 1493, and there's no tetrads after that until 2500. Do you think God's doing a special thing right here using the blood moons as a sign of these times? Well, he already has. Because based on what the first 2 blood moons, what happened with them, I told you last spring to expect a war in Israel this summer, that Israel will win. Because in 49, after the blood moons, Israel won a war. In 67, after the blood moons, Israel won a war. I told you there's going to be a blood moon and Israel's going to win a war, and that's exactly what happened, just based on history. But God has used all 3 of these tetrads that are clustered within a 70-year period of time right now in this generation that Jesus talked about to be here and have significance dealing with Israel. Now, is that pretty unusual? Yes, it's very unusual. I mean, it is so unusual. Wrap your heads around this. So unusual that it's got to mean something big. What? I don't know. We're not in the tribulation. It doesn't match up with Revelation 6:12. But God is using the signs to get our attention. Signs in the sky. Now, that's not just all. Because this year, On the first day, it says Adar 29, Nisan 1. That is the first day of the Jewish religious year. There's going to be a total solar eclipse. And then does it show it here? Yes, on the Feast of Trumpets, which is the first day of the Jewish civil year. Got to get these right. The religious year starts in the spring, the civil year starts in the fall. There's going to be a partial solar eclipse. So this year you have 4 significant dates on the Jewish calendar that are dotted with total solar eclipse, 2 total lunar eclipses, and a partial solar eclipse. Is that not unusual? I mean, statistically, what you're hearing is impossible. Nothing like this has ever happened before in all of human history. And we're living in the times when it's happening. Yes, there have been tetrads, and yes, they've fallen on there have been 8 tetrads altogether that have fallen on Jewish feasts down through the course of history. So that's not unusual, but to have 3 of them fall together in a 70-year period, that is unusual. And then to have the solar eclipses and the lunar eclipses on the first day of the civil and religious new year, you throw that into the mix, I'm telling you, folks, this is big. How big? What's going to happen now? I don't know, but it's big. And at first I thought it'd be really cool to be in Israel when that Passover happened. I'm glad we're going to be home. This is big. So something's going to happen. This is just something to keep your eyes on. No, I don't necessarily think there's going to be another war. Could be or could not, but there was only one war in the early tetrad and only one war in the second tetrad. So I don't know what's going to happen here. I felt pretty confident last spring based on what I had seen in the other ones. I have no idea what's happening. All I can tell you is this is one of the most unique celestial phenomenons relating to the Bible and Jesus and the feasts that we will ever see and that anybody will ever see for another 600 and some years. It's that unique. And to have 3 of them in a 70-year period of time, just absolutely, totally unique. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. Now let's look at something else. 2015, this year that we're in, is a sabbatical year. It happened to start, however, in 2014. When the Feast of Trumpets starts, that starts the new year. So on 9/25 of 14, that started the 2015 Jewish year. Well, that's our terminology. It started year 5775 in the Hebrew year. So they were in their new year for 3 months before they ever got in 2015. So the point being is, when we say we're in a new year, it starts January 1st. So we're in 2015. The Jews started year 5775 on September 24 of 2014. They're in their new year. Now, we call it 2015, so I kind of have to go back and forth on this. But when it says that 2015 is the sabbatical year, that means it started last fall on the 25th of September. Now, what is the sabbatical year? The Sabbath year is the rest of the land. I guess I had it up there, didn't I? We have here Leviticus 25 that explains it, verses 1 through 7, and I want to read them because I want you to understand it. The Lord spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land," okay, he's not saying when you're out here in the wilderness, when you come into the land and you possess that land, which I'm going to give you, then the land shall be a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow in your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vine and gather its crop. But during the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field, nor prune your vine. Your harvest after growth you shall not reap, and your grapes or untrimmed vines you shall not gather. The land shall be a sabbatical year. It tells us elsewhere in Scripture that during the sabbatical year, God's going to provide for them overabundance in the 6th year. They have enough to get them through until the 8th year. Verse 6, all of you shall have the Sabbath products of the land for food, yourselves and your male and your female slaves and your hired men and your foreign resident, those who live as aliens with you. Even your cattle and your animals that are in the land shall have all its crops to eat. So it's just kind of like manna in the wilderness, where God gave them manna for 6 days, and he gave them enough on the 6th day to last for the 7th. And that's what the sabbatical year was. So it's supposed to be. Most of the Jews have not been practicing this. Most of the Jews are not religious. Those who are religious have found ways to get around practicing this. And it's kind of like, I'm going to sell my land to Paula this year because then I don't own it and Paula can do whatever she wants and then she's going to sell it back to me next year. You know, they've been getting by with it, like things like that. However, this year, the government has given $23 million to the farmers and the people to get them not to turn over the crops this year because it's the sabbatical year and they want them to start following the biblical aspects of the Sabbath year. I mean, it's so much easier to ignore God and do it yourself than you know you have food. It's so much easier not to pay your tithe because then you have 10% more to pay your bills with. But what does God tell us about the tithe or about money? Yeah, it's all His anyway. He provides. And He says, he who sows sparingly shall also reap sparingly. And he who sows bountifully shall reap bountifully. That's what He says in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. So God's the one that supplies. Do you think He can supply enough food in the 7th year so that they can make it through into the 8th? Absolutely. Well, yeah, she says it's a normal crop rotation. It's just good. I'm not a farmer, but those of you who are farmers, isn't it just good to leave the land fallow for 1 year for the normal crop rotation? So God knew what He was doing. He wasn't just giving them rules. He knew that that was good for them in the long run. Well, the Jews haven't really been practicing it, but they're trying to get them to do it properly, biblically this year. The point I want to make is 2015 is the Sabbath year. I mean, it's not enough that we have the tetrad of blood moons. We also have it as the Sabbath year, which is holy to the Lord. That's what the Sabbath year is, and we're in it now. It ends at sunset the day before the Feast of Trumpets. That's not all. And there's more. Because 2015 is the year of the Shemitah. If you've read Jonathan Cahn's book, this gives you a little understanding, because this is the remission of debts. It's not just the Sabbath of the land, but it's the Shemitah, the remission of debts. In Deuteronomy 15, verse 1, it tells us what that means. I've got the verses up there too, but that's a different passage. In chapter 15, verse 1, it says, "At the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a remission of debts." That's Shemitah, remission of debts. That's different than letting the land grow fallow. So this passage is from Deuteronomy 15, 1 through 6, and it goes all the way through. And it explains the idea of how you do it. The Bible is very specific on how you deal with the fallowing of the ground in the Sabbath year and how you deal with the remission of debts. And if you buy something, if somebody sells you their land a year before the Shemitah year, then you prorate it so they can buy it back. So there's lots of rules that go along with this. And God's very specific about it. Now let me ask you a question. Why would God be so specific in the Bible about the feasts? Why would He be so specific about the year of Sabbath? Why would He be so specific about the Shemitah year? Why would He be so specific about the year of Jubilee in the Bible? I mean, why is God so specific about these things? Clearly, these are important to God. Why? I don't know. Why is it so important to turn over your land, not turn over your land the 7th year? Probably good for the crops. Why is it so important to remit the debts every 7 years? Well, actually, He tells us in Scripture, a couple of things just to pinpoint, is that all of these things are dress rehearsals. As God is using them. They're the Feast of Moedims, which are really God's dress rehearsal for the Jews, which the Gentiles will eventually be grafted into. God's got His own clock, His own timetable, His own calendar. And that's what the feasts are. That's what Shemitah is. That's what the Moedims are. That's what all of this is about. God's timing. As Aaron said, it's not for the Jews, it's for God. It's God's timing. And if He used His feasts as His calendar for the Jews, and they all pointed to Christ, can't we expect to see some of the other things that He planned as pointing to Christ and as pointing to the return of Christ? I mean, it's so unusual to have the Shemitah year, the year of, possibly the year of Jubilee, we'll get into that in a minute, the year of remission, that's the year of Shemitah, the year of Sabbath, and the blood moons, all together within a year or so period of time. So unusual. Statistically, I wouldn't even begin to figure out how unusual it is. She gave a very good point there. Again, too much for me to say, but one thing I want to point out is in Daniel chapter 7, we see a very interesting prophecy about the Antichrist in the future. He tells us in verse 25 that this future world leader that we call the Antichrist will speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints of the Highest One. And he will intend to make alterations in times and in laws. And the Jews, will be given into his hands for 3.5 years, times and half a time. Anyway, these that we're talking about, everything we're talking about is God's timing, God's clock. And Satan's going to come in and he's going to try and turn it around to his clock and his timing through the Antichrist. Typical. Everything that God does, Satan will do the opposite. All right, let's go back to the timing of the Sabbath and the Shemitah year. In Deuteronomy 31, verse 10, it says, Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, at the time of the year of remission, at the Feast of Booths, ... That tells you right there that the Shemitah year, the Sabbath year, starts on the Feast of Trumpets and ends at sunset at the end of the year, which we know this year is going to be in September. So, the Sabbath year, the Shemitah year, began at sunset before, so on the 23rd of September, because the feast was on the 24th, at sunset, the Shemitah and the Sabbath year began, and it will end really on sunset then on the 7th or the 11th of September this year. All, isn't that interesting, right in the middle of the timing of the blood moons. Now, let's look at the possibility of a Jubilee year thrown into that. This is a possibility. We're not sure about the Jubilee year, and I'll tell you why. But before I do, what is the Jubilee year? It's listed here. Oh, I forgot to put the reference in it. Deuteronomy 25. I'm sorry, Leviticus 25. But what is the Jubilee year? Okay. 7 Sabbaths. It ends at sunset on the 11th of September because it's the sunset before the Feast of Trumpets starts. See, that just went right over my head until you said that. What she pointed out is that, see, the Jewish day starts at sunset, the day before. So when the Feast of Trumpets starts this fall, holy moly, with the partial solar eclipse on September 12th, it actually starts at sunset on September 11th, which is 9/11. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Good catch. Good point. The year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee, as she said, it's 7 Sabbaths. So you take 7 times 7. It's 49 years. And then on the 50th year, you have a year of Jubilee. This is God's clock, his timing for Israel. What happens on the year of Jubilee? Well, let's read it. This is Deuteronomy 25, starting with verse 8. You also count to 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, so that you have the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years, namely 49 years. You shall then sound a ram's horn abroad on the 10th day of the 7th month. So the Jubilee year doesn't start and end on the Feast of Trumpets, as the other years do. This starts on the Day of Atonement, which is 10 days after the Feast of Trumpets. It says you shall sound a ram's horn. And by the way, that's what Jubilee means. It means ram's horn. That's legally what it means, but it really means deliverance. That's the idea of deliverance. You shall thus consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release through the land of all of its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. You shall have the 50th year as a jubilee. You shall not sow, nor reap its aftergrowth, nor gather in from its untrimmed vines. For it is a jubilee, it shall be holy to you. You shall eat its crops out of the field. You shall eat its crops out of the field. So think of this. You've got the 7th Sabbath, the 49th year, which is a year of Sabbath. That means you can't furrow the ground. You can't plow the ground. Then you have the Jubilee that's the next year. Can't plow the ground. So you got to plow ground on the 48th year. You don't plow it on the 49th. You don't plow it on the 50th. You can't plow until the 51st. And God's going to provide. Do you trust God to provide during those times? Absolutely. Israel did. Well, for a period of time, not for long. But they were supposed to. And God would provide. If God puts you in a period of drought for 2 years, and I've known many that haven't had jobs for 2 years, we take matters into our own hands, but I can tell you testimony after testimony of people that God has provided them miraculously in those 2 years when they had nothing. Yes, he does. So we have possibly, now the problem is with the Jubilee year, nobody knows when the Jubilee is for sure, so Israel's not following it right now. Then that makes sense. I mean, it's pretty hard when you come back into your land after all those years to know. But Jubilee comes from the year Yovel. That tells you that it means ram's horn, but it really means liberation. It begins on the Day of Atonement. The Shemitah year ended. Now, this is interesting. The Shemitah year ended in 1965. This is the year of release. And many people believe that perhaps the Jubilee year started then in 1966, and it was 1967 that Israel gained control of their land. If there was a Shemitah year in 65 with the Jubilee afterwards, the same thing could be that there's a Shemitah that ends in 15. The Jubilee year would start in 16 instead of 15, but that means it would start in the fall of 15 and go into 16, and maybe God would further liberate Jerusalem in that Jubilee year. So there's a lot of people that believe, because of some of the things that have happened to Israel recently, that the Jubilee year may start at the end of 15. Again, they don't know for sure, but that's a possibility. Now, there's also a possibility that this Jubilee year is the 70th Jubilee year that God promised in in Leviticus 25. Why? You take 70 Jubilees times 50 years of Jubilee, you come up to 3,500 years. And you subtract that from 2016, or maybe 2015, however you want to do it, and you get 1484 BC. Well, you got to subtract 48.61 years because they have a 360-day calendar instead of 365. So you get a discrepancy right around about 1435 BC. Now, I'm not a mathematician, and I haven't gone through all the possibilities here. Actually, you have to deduct a year between 1 BC and 1 AD because there is no zero. So it'd actually be 1434 BC. But that, you're getting very near the time, you're past the Exodus at this point, and you're getting very near the time where the Israelites went into the land.
Thank you for joining us today on Living Word Ministries with Debbie Blank. Living Word Ministries is a listener-supported program. To contact Debbie Blank, you may do so at livingwordministry.org. That's www.livingwordministry.org.